Hello there and welcome back to this JavaScript course where today we're going to be starting up Unit 2. And in this first lesson, we're going to be going over variables. So without further ado, let's get right into this. All right, so what is a variable? Well, a variable is a reference to a location in memory, which we can then use to set a value into that location or retrieve the value. Okay, so I understand this may be a little bit confusing here, but essentially, if you really think about a computer and what it actually does at a very, very low level, if you take a look at the hardware components of it, it pretty much all is separated into one of two groups. Either it somehow processes data or it stores data, right? So, for example, the processor, it processes data, right? So it's just the processor is like the main processing part of the computer, right? So it'll perform mathematical operations on data. The hard drive, it stores data. RAM, it stores data. The video card, right? It will process data. It will also perform mathematical operations, slightly different from how the processor does it, but the idea is pretty much the same. So that essentially is how a computer is divided. So there's just two parts: storing data, working with data. So variables provide a way in working with a programming language to have an organized organized place where you can put where you can store values that you may need at a later time in your code. So just to give you an example here, let's imagine that we're creating a calculator program, right? And you enter a value like 5 into the calculator. And now a new screen pops up, and I know this isn't like the best way to create a calculator, but we'll just go with it for the sake of example. A new screen pops up where you need to enter the next value. So what do you do with your old value that you enter? So you have to know both values in order to actually go ahead and perform a calculation like addition, right? You need to know both of them, and right now you only know one. And you're going to lose it since you're going to a new screen. Well, what you would do is you would store it in a variable, and then that variable. And then once you get the second value on the second screen, then you can go and reference that variable, and you can go to add them together and give the result. Now, you may be asking what a variable does under the hood. I mean, you're not quite asking that quite yet since you haven't actually seen it. But essentially, what it does under the hood is it tells the computer, or not necessarily the computer, pretty much the computer to allocate part of memory. So in computer memory, so RAM, random access memory, that's what computers have. It's where they store data. If they won't need that data after they shut off, that's pretty much where they store it. And it goes in and just allocates part of that RAM. So for the sake of example, let's just say maybe 8 bits of that RAM. It takes 8 bits of that RAM, so 8 slots essentially, where we can store either a 1 or a 0. And it goes in and it takes those 8 bits and it says, well, we're going to need those for later, right? So we have this variable called A, let's just call it A, and that variable is tied to those 8 bits, so don't touch those 8 bits. Those are our bits, essentially. And that essentially is what that does. And then when we assign a value to a variable, so then when we go ahead and do, hey, JavaScript, go ahead and insert 5 into the number 5 into the variable. We're going to set it to 5. It's going to go ahead and take that 5 and go ahead and put it inside those 8 bits that we allocated for the number 5. Now, obviously, it's not quite that simple. There's also then a process to delete variables once we don't need them anymore called garbage collection, which JavaScript does automatically for us in other languages, in some other languages. It's not done automatically, and we have to sort of do it ourselves. But that essentially is the whole idea behind variables. Okay, so now that we got the sort of theory out of the way, let's go and take a look at how we can actually work with variables in the JavaScript language. All right, so here we are in our text editor. Let me go ahead and create a new folder here. This is going to be for Unit 2 since we have started Unit 2. Unit 2, there we go. I'll create a new file in there called 1.1.html. Actually, you know what? Let's just call it 2.1. Yeah, that would be right. 2.1.html. There we go. We can just go ahead and copy in everything that we had in 1.1.html, since we're just going to be writing some JavaScript today. Okay, so now in this handle click method, what we're going to go ahead and do is declare a variable, okay? So we're just going to do var a and a semicolon. Don't forget the semicolon. And there we go. That's just how you declare a variable. So by doing this, essentially what you're telling the application is to go ahead and take part of memory and go ahead and reserve it for this variable. And now this a will point to some part in memory. Now all of that is abstracted away from us, so we can't quite see that happening, especially since this is JavaScript is an interpreted language which will then go through a browser. So it's slightly even more complex than I sort of described it. But the general idea is there. So the general idea of a variable is the same. So now that variable a exists, right? And it doesn't have a value. So let's go ahead and try console.logging a to see what it's, well, I mean, it doesn't have a value, but let's see what happens when we do console.log a. If a had something inside it, like a number or a string or something, it would go ahead and print that number or string to the console. But right now it doesn't. So let's go ahead and have a look at what will happen when it doesn't. Let's reveal this in Finder. There it is. Drag that into Chrome. Inspect this. Where is the... there it is. There's a console. Let me make this bigger. There we go. And let's go ahead and click on the button. And there we go. You can see now that what we actually do get is undefined, which essentially makes sense since our variable doesn't have anything inside it, so it is undefined. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so what if we wanted to actually assign something to a variable? So if we wanted to put in a value into the memory slot that this variable sort of points to? Well, all we would have to do really is, well, there are a couple of ways we can do it. We can go and after we declare it, we can go and assign a value. We can do a equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example. Okay, let's save that and let's refresh and then let's click on the button. And there we go. You can see now that it prints 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as expected. Or we can go ahead and just take this and just put it up here inside the declaration. Just like that. And let's click on that. And there we go. You can see we get the exact same effect. And so now a has this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 value. Okay, so one other thing to note is that we can actually go ahead and declare multiple variables at the same time. So if we go ahead and do a, comma b, comma c, we can now interact with them separately. So we can do a equals 1, don't forget the semicolon, b equals 2, and then, c equals something like 12. Okay? And then if we go ahead and duplicate these, we can do a, b, and then c. Let's refresh, and there we go. You can see now we get 1, 2, and 12. So if we don't have, just to show you here, if we don't have a variable defined, right? If we go and delete this and then this as well, and try to access a variable, what we're going to get is an error. So let's go ahead and refresh the page here. Let's click on the button. And there we go. You can see now that we have uncaught reference error. C is not defined at handle click. It actually gives us, it's very handy. It actually gives us the location of the error. So we can see 2.1.html and then 13. So this is the 13th line. And there we go. We can see that this is the source of the error. So C right here is not defined. And so that's why we're getting this error here. So yeah, we need to add that C back in like that. There we go. So throughout pretty much the entirety of this lesson, we've been working with variables that are numbers, right? And that's always great. But there are multiple things that we can put into variables other than numbers. First of all, we're gonna stick with numbers here for just a minute here. But there's also a floating point value, and in JavaScript there's really no difference. A floating point value is actually just a value with a decimal point. And in JavaScript, it doesn't really treat values differently that are with a decimal point or are not with a decimal point. So if we have a equals 1, it's all of data type number, and we're going to talk about data types in just a second here. So we can go and actually assign something like 1.0 here, and then do 2.3 here, and then 12.1 here. And that's going to work exactly the same. So if we go to refresh and print it out, there we go. We can see we get 1, and it drops a 0 here since it doesn't make a difference. We get 2.3 for B, and then 12.1 for C. So that essentially is how the decimal points work. So we can go and add decimal points as we like. But we can also go ahead and create strings as variables. So I'm sure you've already seen us create a string in our Hello World example. We inserted we inserted it directly into console.log, but we can also store them in variables. And what we can go ahead and do here in A, for example, is do 12 as a string. And we can actually mix in characters there as well, since it is a string. So if you go ahead and refresh the page, click the button, you're going to see here that it prints 12A, since that is a string. So you may naturally be asking, how many data types are there in JavaScript? Well, I do have a handy little slide here. And there we go. We can see in this handy little slide, we can see 5 of the sort of main variable types. And these can actually be divided. So Boolean, numeric, and string, they are sort of, well, not quite numeric, it's number, but they're sort of separate from this array and object. So we can sort of like create a line here, imagine like an invisible line here, because these variables are primitive. Which there is a bit of distinction from the two. These sort of point to values and these point to references. So it's slightly different, but the idea here, there's no need to worry about that too much for now. Once we start we're going to go more over objects in Unit 4, I believe. Yeah, in Unit 4. No, 3. Yeah, in Unit 3. In the next unit, we're going to be going over objects. And we'll talk a little bit more about that there. But essentially, the whole idea behind Boolean is that it is either true or false, which is quite useful when we're going to be going over conditional operations in just a few lessons here. So that's pretty useful. And we're going to demonstrate that in a second here. Numeric, we've already seen. It can be either a number or a number with a decimal point. There can also be negative numbers as well. So that's something I didn't mention. Strings, we saw how to use a string, and we're actually going to have a separate lesson on using strings in a few lessons here. And then array as well, and we are going to be going over arrays separately also, but essentially they are just a list. And then object, that's just, we are going to be going over objects in the next unit, but they are essentially just, data types that have a key value, that have a key and a value behind that key. So that's essentially the object type. But again, we're going to be going over object in the next unit. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at how. And there is also null and undefined, like we saw, but those are sort of, they're not quite data types in the way that we can work with them. So I left them off the list, but they also exist and they are technically data types. Okay, so for now, let's have a look at these 4. Let's pay attention to these 4: Boolean, numeric, string, and array, and let's have a look at how to create each of them in the code. Okay, so in the code here, so we already do know how to create a string, as we can see here, and a number, a numeric value as well. Let me demonstrate the negative here, that we can make it negative. So let me go to refresh, and there we go. You can see we get negative 2.3. So yeah, that's we can make a negative. So we have string and numeric values created. Now let's create a Boolean down here. So C is going to be a Boolean. And inside C, we're going to have true. Okay? And that's going to make C a Boolean of type true, right? So let's go and refresh. And there we go. You can see it prints true. We also have false as well for the Boolean. There we go, it prints false. So that is actually very, very useful because when we're going to be going over conditional operations like if statements or while loops, they're going to be used quite a bit in to perform logic. And in real life, well, not in real life, in actual programming, professional programming, they are used a lot to perform actual business logic, and they're a big part of that. So definitely Booleans are very important. Then we also have lists. So lists, we can go ahead and do lists. So like this. We can have a list here, just 2 square brackets, and then inside there we can go and put values. Whatever values we want. And then we can even mix and match data types however we want. And then we can even put a different list in there. Like that. 1, 2, 3, 2, like that. Completely whatever we want. There we go. You can see that it prints that list with the values. Okay, so we are also going to have a separate lesson on lists, where how we can retrieve values from lists, how we can sort of get their length, how we can work with them, work with data inside them, and so on and so on. But for now, this is just a very simple example of the data type.